Okay, please don't be too horrified by the handout. It's a complicated argument that I want to discuss at one point, and I needed to be able to sit still, but it isn't going to be horrifying. So today is Grundgesetze, the final major work of Frege, and part of what he's doing there is taking the definition of number that he got clear about in the Grundlagen and codifying that in the language of the Begriffsschrift, and doing that in a way that is sensitive to the distinction between sense and reference, between Sinn and Bedeutung, that he had just come to. So the first volume of the Grundgesetz is published in 1893. Those essays, Sinn and Bedeutung, was written in 91. So he's pulling together these threads in the Grundgesetz. Let me remind you briefly about the account from last time of what that distinction of sense and reference is. I was pitching it in terms of the two substitutional semantic hierarchies, one of which is what you get if you apply his substitutional methodology, noting invariance under substitution salva veritate, and the other if you note invariance under substitution salva consequentiae, saving the truth value or saving the goodness of implications and incompatibilities that expressions are involved in. And in each case, what you do is use those invariants to define equivalence relations, which can be the abstractors in terms of which you define on the side of consequences, senses, and on the side of truth, Bedeutung. And I had suggested what I called a computational model of senses, which is supposed to pull together a number of the things that he says about senses. The claim was that the sense of an expression is a set of analyses of that expression, substitutional functional analyses, ways of breaking it down into the application of a function to an argument or some arguments. So if you have an expression like 2 to the 4th, you can see that as the application of the function raised 2 to some power, that function applied to the argument 4 to give you the value 16, or you can see it as the result of applying the function raised to the 4th power applied to the argument 2. That also is a way of computing the value 16. The claim is that those functions applied to arguments, fatas, are modes of presentation. So one of the things he says about senses is that they contain modes of presentation. The sense in which each of those functions applied to arguments, which you get by different analyses of the expression into functions and arguments, they all compute the same value. They all have the same value, 16, which is the Bedeutung of the expression 2 to the 4th. It doesn't matter how you compute it, you get that value. And I suggested that we think of the senses as just consisting in all of those functions applied to arguments into which you can analyze the expression 2 to the 4th. They're all ways of computing the Bedeutung of the expression. The other thing he says about senses is that they determine the cognitive value of the expression. And I suggested we think of the cognitive value as the inferential role that it plays, not as a specifically epistemological issue, but really as a semantic issue, and tried to interpret the discussion of the difference between the morning star and the evening star, for instance, the difference of sense, as a difference in the inferential roles that they play. The fact that they're not intersubstitutable, saving the goodness of inferences, though they are intersubstitutable, saving the truth value of the claims. So all of that is meant as an interpretation of what Frege is doing. This, I think, is not a specifically, well, this is reasonably close to the text. It's trying to make sense of the things he says in the text. I don't think it belongs in a box with, say, my readings of Hegel, which are at a much greater remove from the texts than I mean this computational model to be removed from Frege's text. I'm thinking here of the Bomo. Those of you who are graduate students in the department have no doubt heard before that the angstrom, named after my colleague Steve, is a unit of hermeneutic distance. It's the smallest unit, the smallest distance there can be between a text and a reading of the text, such that the reading counts as a reading of the text and not simply the text itself. And on that same scale, the other unit of hermeneutic distance is the Brandom, which is the maximal distance there can be between a reading and the text, and have it count as a reading of the text. And I embrace that description for my Hegel readings. But I would insist that this computational model is somewhere in the sweet spot, in the middle between these extreme ends of the hermeneutic spectrum. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question on the notion of cognitive value. Is it translating Erkenntniswert here?
Mm-hmm.
I always, like, whenever I see Erkenntniswert in Frege, my immediate association is something like insight, because I associate it with, like, this is something that an identity statement has, even though, it's not, it's mysterious how it is informative. That's the beginning thought of the Bedeutung. I always thought it was supposed to capture, like, a moment of insight into something. But so the insight into the inferential role is that.
Well, I mean, he talks about it as what is grasped when you understand the expression, and people read that in an epistemological way and in a way that has to do with, I don't know, your ideas about things, even though, of course, the senses are what is grasped, not your grasping of them. But my claim is, look, the difference between A equals A and A equals B is that if you conjoin them with another premise, say P of A, if you conjoin A equals A, all you get is P of A as a conclusion. But if you conjoin A equals B with P of A, you get something new, you get P of B. That difference in inferential role, I say, is what senses capture. And
you don't need an epistemic reading to get there.
Right. Now, I may at the end of this session get back to talking about the thought essay, where in his discussion of first person, when Dr. Gust, the famous now Dr. Gustav Laubin, says, "I have been wounded," Frege says, well, and each of us is given to ourselves in a unique way. Now that's the epistemic sort of cognitive grasp sort of picture. It's at one remove from this computation of the Bedeutung mode of presentation picture that I have. I think they're compatible, but I also think people have been misled by taking that as a paradigm of a sense, as opposed to a barely intelligible marginal case. Now, my contribution last time to this computational model was to say, although Frege can do everything he needs to do with that notion in the Grundgesetze, there's something he can't do with that. What he can't do is solve one of the problems that drove Kant to his notion of synthesis, and that is to understand the very possibility of there being essentially multi-premise inferences. That is, inferences where the conclusion is contained corporately in the premises. It follows from all of them, so it's implicit in the set of premises in the literal sense of being implied by them, but is not contained in any one of them, not implied by any one of them. And Kant said, well, they have to be put together in a special way. They have to be synthesized in order for you to be able to get anything new out of them. I mean, that's only one of the functions that, this meta-concept is performing for Kant. And the claim that there's one notion that can do all these things is, one of his central innovations. I'd say compare all the different jobs, all the different ways that he distinguishes concepts from intuitions, all the different distinctions that he lines up with that, not carelessly, but because his view is, that's his theory, is that you can line these things up and understand things with them. Now, I say Frege can't, doesn't have an account of the possibility of essentially multi-premise inferences in general. He will specifically, in the construction of the Grundgesetze, he constructs contents for logically complex expressions such that it follows from the definitions of the logical concepts, the conditional and negation paradigmatic among them, that you can get something out the other end as a conclusion that was not contained in any of the particular ones. So if you have P and you have if P then Q, you can conclude Q, which is not implied by, contained in either of the premises, but that's because of what the conditional means. He's introduced it precisely in terms of the multi-premise inferences that it underwrites, which means that he has an account of essentially multi-premise logical inferences and incompatibilities, inconsistencies. Those are, for Kant, those are things that follow in virtue of the form, the logical form of the premises, not in virtue of the non-logical content of them. And that's good enough for Frege in the Grundgesetze, because all he wants is the logical contents of expressions. But that only works if you're building from the bottom up. If you're starting with some meanings and constructing all of your logically complex sentences, and then looking only at the implications that follow in virtue of logic alone. It's not a general solution. How, if we look at a bunch of good implications or a bunch of candidate implications and assign contents to them, how can we understand in general where there need not be any logical vocabulary involved, the possibility of our still being able to get something, some conclusion out that is not implied by any one of them or even any subset of them. And I suggested this is a problem that Bolzano's big idea is a solution to. Bolzano's big idea is to take the very same substitutional methodology that Frege is employing and apply it where Frege doesn't think to apply it. That is, not just to sentences and the components that we can carve out of sentences, but to whole implications and incompatibilities, to treat the occurrence of a sentence in an implication or an incompatibility as premise or conclusion as a kind of compounding device, and look at which substitutions preserve, for Bolzano, the goodness, preserve the truth of them. Remember, his definition of a good implication is an implication is good if there is some way of dividing the vocabulary that occurs in the sentences, in the premise and conclusion of it, in such a way into fixed and variable, what's defining the function and what are the arguments in Frege's term, into the fixed and variable vocabulary, such that every variation of the variable vocabulary that makes the premises true also makes the conclusion true. Or for incompatibility, that every variation that makes the premises true makes the conclusion false. That's exactly observing invariance of substitution salva veritate that Frege does for subsentential components, even the ones that are themselves sentences, but it's starting with this larger unit of reason relations, of implications and incompatibilities. So this is absolutely available to Frege. It's just another application of the methodology that he's using, and it would let you give an analytic account now, not where you're building up from the bottom, as he does in the Grundgesetze, but where you're analyzing down from the top, starting sort of further up with the reason relations rather than just with the sentences. And this would give another way of sort of unifying these two semantic substitutional hierarchies, the one salva veritate and salva consequentiae, because Bolzano is starting with, in effect, truth values. I mean, they aren't objects for him, but the value as true or false that things have. So I was, in effect, projecting a composite 19th century philosopher, Fregano, who has Frege's computational notion of sense, but extends the computational Fregean notion in the way Bolzano teaches us to do, with this one biggest idea, I claim, of Bolzano. And that gives you something that is a responsive answer to the question that Kant brought with him to his reading of the proof structure of Euclid's Elements, that led him to seeing the contrast between the arguments in Euclid where you do get new stuff, contrasting that with syllogistic where you don't. The Bolzano account, the Fregano account extended, gives us a way of understanding the productivity of Euclidean argument and understanding essentially multi-premise, making intelligible the idea of essentially multi-premise inferences. I said that for Frege, pulling together the different threads of his work, he wants to work in his perspicuous notation that is essentially the same notation as he'd introduced already in the 1879 Begriffsschrift. We add to that a little bit, but there isn't any fundamental difference in the notation that he has. But in the meantime, he's come up with a definition of numbers in Grundlagen, and he's distinguished sense from reference. He wants to formalize, regiment his definition of number, put it in the perspicuous notation of Begriffsschrift, and acknowledge the distinction, keep the two sets of books on senses and Bedeutungen. So we want to see how he pulled all these things together. In general, each expression in the Grundgesetze, if it's a well-formed expression in Grundgesetze, then it has a Bedeutung. His rules have determined what its Bedeutung is. It says what its Bedeutung is. You can compute its Bedeutung from the expression given his rules. The way it's computed is the sense of it. And those senses are not what the expressions say. The senses of them are shown by the perspicuous notation. The notation is designed to make evident and available on inspection what the different function argument analyses of the expression is. Those different function argument expressions are not the Bedeutung of any expressions. He doesn't talk about those modes of computing the Bedeutungen, but the sense in which the notation is perspicuous, what he talked about in the Begriffsschrift book as expressing explicitly the conceptual content, the begriffliche Inhalt of expressions, roughly the inferential role of them, now becomes, it's perspicuous in that the senses are shown. The senses, which are inter alia the ways of computing the Bedeutungen, they are evident in the notation. And this distinction between what's said in the notation and what's shown in it, we can't help looking at, retrospectively through the lens of the Tractatus. It's functioning differently in Frege, even though that's evidently and avowedly the inspiration for the Tractarian use of it. So we want to understand this sense of perspicuous expression of the senses, a kind of showing, where what's shown is how to compute the content of the expression in the sense of its Bedeutung. So this is the conception now, the Grundgesetze conception of the relation between sense and Bedeutung. The Bedeutungs are the values of the expressions, and we've got to have guaranteed that everyone has a value and that you can tell what the value is. The way you tell the value, you compute it by applying a function to an argument, and which functions and which arguments are available to do that, how to compute with them, is to be perspicuously shown by the notation. And that's what drives him to, or anyway rationalizes now, the two-dimensionality of the notation. So that's his task as he sits down after the Grundlagen and after the distinction between sense and reference has been introduced, which he describes as a splitting of the notion of conceptual content into two parts. And now he looks back at his remarks about the Begriffsschrift as confused because he wasn't distinguishing between the Bedeutungen that you compute, that are the values of the expressions, and what's merely shown but perspicuously by the notation, namely how you compute those values, the modes of presentation that make up the senses, all of them, that entire set of all the functional decompositions of the expressions, all the ways of dividing it into a fixed vocabulary and a variable vocabulary and considering assimilating it to the substitutional variants of it, the ones that are applications of the same function to different arguments. That's what's perspicuously shown in the new notation. Now, yeah, Nick.
This is, of course, a Wittgenstein comment. You know that the saying showing distinction works differently in the Tractatus, but I'm still struck by how similar Wittgenstein's, like the Wittgenstein of the investigation seems like, or similarly, he seems to use the notion of perspicuous presentation. It's so much later. Like for him, it's the sense of like perspicuous presentation is perspicuous because it orients you. It shows you how to get from here to there, and it does this often by adding an intermediary step to the presentation. This seems to be what's happening here, right? We're showing the computing, and like the functions that that show how to compute are an intermediary step. Like they stand. We put them in between the expression and the Bedeutung. It's an intermediary. It's like it's the same notion of perspicuity.
I mean, I think this is one of the axial Wittgensteinian ideas, and it shows up in different forms in the early work and in the later work. But I think you're right; it doesn't go away, and there is a sense in which where he gets with it is closer to what Frege was doing than what he did with it in the Tractatus, which he knew he was doing something different with there. No, I think that's right. Now, there's another context, though, in Frege and beyond Frege that I want to emphasize as background for thinking about this project in the Begriffsschrift, in the Grundgesetze, and particularly the part that I want to focus on in it. And this circles back to something we talked about in connection with the Grundlagen, and that's this incredible philosophical and conceptual achievement of Frege's in getting clear about the notion of abstraction. That he really was the first one who knew what he meant when he talked about abstraction and the products of abstraction, what that process is and what the products of it are. But I think it's important to keep in mind what a venerable and important philosophic history this concept had before that. If Frege had done nothing else than give the definition of abstraction that he does in the Grundlagen with his commentary on it, understanding it as a way of introducing new expressions from old ones, in particular defining new sortal kind terms and the singular terms that fall under them, specifying their inferential role, their content, in terms of the inferential content of some old singular terms falling under old sortals, introducing abstract ones on the basis of more concrete ones. If he had done nothing more than explain how equivalence relations can be used as abstractors to introduce genuinely new contents on the basis of old ones and to determine their inferential roles by turning those equivalence relations into or treating them as identities, which have the inferential significance of licensing intersubstitutions. If he had done nothing more than give us that account of abstraction, he would still be the greatest philosopher since Kant, in my view. But to see that, you have to think about the history of that issue, about abstraction. And I think it's not too strong to say that philosophy, at any rate, any kind of systematic philosophy, begins with worrying about abstractions. That's the issue, the pivotal issue between Plato and Aristotle. What's the status of these forms, the repeatables, things like circularity or being an animal? How are they related to the particulars that exhibit those forms, the unrepeatable particular things that can be grouped together in this way, that share these forms, or to just talk about the function that the forms are performing, these repeatables. This is something Sellers has wonderful discussions of in his nominalism essays from 1960 and 61. By contrast to most of the issues that Sellers addresses, which are distinctively issues of modern philosophy that have to do with how to make sense of us in the world that natural science tells us we inhabit, that's the source of distinctively modern philosophical problems. But there are also perennial philosophical problems for Sellers. And principal among them, perhaps the most important of them, is what he calls the problem of the many and the one. That is what's at issue between Plato and Aristotle, separability of the forms, and so the issue on which Aristotle, acknowledging his substantial departure from Platonic orthodoxy, famously says, I love Plato, but I love truth more, as sort of explaining, justifying his divergence. But we see this in, again, one of the axial issues of scholastic philosophy is what they called the problem of universals, how to think about circularity or green or being an animal, how to think about those things, those repeatable, universal properties in relation to the particulars that exhibit them. If we think about the realism of Aquinas, or the more sophisticated realism of Scotus, saying, look, these things are just part of the furniture of the universe, or the nominalism of William of Ockham, who says, no, it's actually just a matter of our words, that we use the same word for these things, but it's not picking out anything in the things. It's essential to our thinking, but not to the things we're thinking about. And the sophisticated conceptualism of Abelard, sort of in between. No, it's not just the words. There is some grounding in the things, but still, these are our concepts, grounded though they are. As I say, this is one of the axial problem of universalists, one of the axial issues of scholastic philosophy, comes over into early modern philosophy, not so much on the side of ontology as on the side of epistemology. Abstraction is absolutely central to the empiricist view about how you can get from the sensory intake of the particular sensory intake of particulars to something that looks like thinking with them, to conceptual representations of them. we look at repetition, we look at, I can think of it as consanguinity. We can look at them coming together, but abstraction is really the key move. And the rationalists who are thinking of these universals as the things we think with have got the same problem. Well, so how is it we can use them to think about these particulars, these confused things? I take it that this is all extremely hand-wavy, but that the scholastics by and large agreed on a picture. They were all Christians, and they thought, these things are whatever else they are. They're in the mind of God. They thought Plato had more or less gotten the ontology of them right, but they thought Aristotle had more or less gotten the epistemology of them right. The story about how we could take them in and how use them in our thought. I would say the early moderns cared more about the epistemology as the epistemology was turning into semantics than they did about the ontology, though, for instance, the difference between real definition and nominal definition is not just epistemological, it's ontological. Anyway, I'm making all these vague noises to remind you, really, just how central in the philosophical tradition thinking about the relation between the things that Frege teaches us to think about as introduced by abstraction, the notion of the color of something as, well, if it's true that X is green, Y is green, and so on, then there's an equivalence relation between them. We can talk about the color that they share. As always, the fixed end of the analogy is moving from the parallelism of lines as the equivalence relation to the introduction of directions. And I would say that by and large, what contemporary analytic metaphysics has to apply to this issue, I'm thinking of things like trope theory about properties that says, no, it's the particular, what's ontologically fundamental are the particular instances of green, the green of this portion of the leaf right now. And the notion of green, or even of a shade of green, is a construction somehow. We've put those many together into a one, and the trope theorist has to have a story about that. Or at the other end of some spectrum, David Armstrong saying what universals are is roles in laws of nature, that it's assimilating things accordingly as they play the same role with respect to necessary connections and possibilities laid down in laws of nature. Again, this is an account of the many and the one. What's new is we have Frege's apparatus of abstraction to use to think about that. Now, in Frege, I said he gives us a definition of number in Grundlagen. Well, he gives us a number of definitions of number there. The second definition that he gives is where he introduces the notion of abstraction and says he's realized, again, what nobody else realized about numbers, that statements of numbers are statements about concepts. It's really only after Grundlagen that he thinks he really knows what a concept is, namely a function whose value is a truth value. It's a much shorter answer to the question, what is a concept, than anybody before him could have conceivably given, at least before you unpack that definition. So he's realized that statements of numbers, the number of Jupiter's moons is 4, he thought, is a statement about a concept, and that we can say by abstraction that two concepts exhibit the same number in case what falls under them can be put in one-to-one correspondence. So we're treating that one-to-one correspondence, that's an equivalence relation. We can use that as the abstractor, turn it into an identity, treat it as an identity, formulate it by saying, the number of planets is 9. For instance, putting, the number of strokes in the successor numeral into one-to-one correspondence with the number of the planets, just as we can say the direction of a line is such and such, introducing that. But he immediately raises a challenge for that mode of procedure, and that's the Julius Caesar problem, that abstraction will not settle the truth of all the identities. It only settles the truth of what we might call the homogeneous identities, the identities of expressions that are of the form, the direction of line L, for instance, the direction of the Earth's axis. It'll tell us whether the direction of the Earth's axis is the same as the direction of the axis of Venus. It is, just in case they're parallel, and otherwise not. But Julius Caesar, is he identical to the direction of the Earth's axis or not? That's a heterogeneous identity, because Julius Caesar is not an expression of the form, the direction of line such and such. So he says, so we've determined some of the inferences, the truth value of some of the intersubstitutions that are licensed by identities, but not all of them. We haven't settled the truth of all the identities here. What to do? And to remind you, his third definition introduces the concept of an extension and says a number is the extension of the concept equinumerous with, which is a higher order concept that can apply to two concepts, just in case their extensions, we can now say, can be put in one-to-one correspondence. And we have that infamous footnote. I assume it is known what extensions are, because we presupposed that along the way is the thought. But he clearly had, was perfectly aware that that was an unsatisfactory way of leaving things. You should make the compromises you need to finish your book, but you shouldn't forget about them when you've made those compromises. And he didn't. And in Function and Concept, then, he defines the notion of extension as a special case of the notion of course of values, the course of values of a function, where two functions have the same course of values, just in case they have the same value for each argument. And then he can say, and extensions are the courses of values of concepts, where concepts are a particular kind of function, namely functions that have truth values as their values. Doesn't matter what their arguments are. Any function that has exclusively truth values as its values is a concept. So he puts together his notion of abstraction and his notion of concept, and defines the notion of the extension of a concept, and so defines a number as the number of a concept, as the extension of the concept equinumerous as applied to concepts. So that's what he needs to put into the perspicuous language of Begriffsschrift, is that definition of number, that notion of extension. So in the step he needed in function and concept was to introduce courses of values by abstraction. And that's what he's going to use in the Grundgesetze. The Bedeutungen of all the expressions of the Grundgesetze are courses of values. That's what you compute with them. The first two objects he introduces are the truth values, the true and the false, and a decisive move, anyway, a crucial move early on in the Grundlagen, in section 10, is to define the truth values as courses of values, of functions. In effect, he defines the true as the value of x equals x, the statement A equals A. The true is the course of values of that function, and the false is the course of values of the function. It's not the case that for all A equals A. So we get unnecessarily a logically false statement and a logically true statement that we can understand in terms of the intersubstitutional reading of identities, and this general apparatus of forming courses of values. Then we can build to the sky, and in particular can define counting numbers using them. So that's what he's aiming to do in the Grundgesetze. That project is responsible for a number of the crucial features of it. The only expressions that are well-formed expressions of Grundgesetze are singular terms. Singular terms have objects, particulars, as their Bedeutungen, and their inferential role is determined by the identity claims, the true identity claims involving them. And we understand identity claims as intersubstitution licenses, that in asserting A is identical to B, A equals B, you're committing yourself to the goodness of all inferences of the form P of A, therefore P of B, and vice versa. And that's all the inferences he needs are licensed by identities, licensed by intersubstitution. So he's using all this apparatus from the Grundlagen, right, where we came to understand singular terms as what can flank identities, because the inferential role of the identities is entirely determined by there being intersubstitution licenses. And what you can intersubstitute in that way is a singular term. This is part of his general strategy of showing that numbers are objects by showing that numerals are singular terms that can essentially occur in true claims. That's what it is to be an existent object for him. This means assimilating sentences to singular terms, even though he sort of started off talking about how fundamentally different they were. It's downstream from Kant, thinking of the sentences as coming first. And in a certain sense they do. because the first Bedeutungen we get are for sentences, the truth values that he introduces. But we're going to understand them, the inferential role of sentences, in terms of intersubstitution licenses that are identity claims with a sentence on one side and a sentence on the other side. So in this way, he's gone over completely to a constructive or, in a non-Kantian sense, synthetic use of this substitutional apparatus. And what we get is a theory of those Bedeutungen, that is, those objects that are referred to by the singular terms he constructs, which are logical objects in the sense that you can demonstrate their existence by logic alone. They're the courses of values, we can say what those are in purely logical terms, of purely logical expressions. So he introduces this world of logical objects. This is really pulling together all the threads in his previous work. And you can see how pivotal the notion of courses of values is. That's what gets him from the Grundlagen to the Grundgesetze, lets him give these one-sentence definitions of concept and of extension of a concept in terms of courses of values. And the introduction of courses of values was, this decisive step conceptually in the Grundgesetze is the dagger through the heart of his enterprise. It's where it all went desperately wrong. It's the reason the system of the Grundgesetze is provably inconsistent. The culprit is the notion of courses of values. And though I didn't assign as reading, I urge you to look in the Beeney collection at the few letters with Russell that are reproduced there. That first letter, Frege, who had never gotten anybody to read his stuff, Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous philosophers in the world, even then had read it, absorbed it, and wrote him an appreciative letter about it, which pointed out that using the apparatus of Grundgesetze, you could define, in effect, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Russell didn't actually see how to do that in Grundgesetze. He just saw that you could do it. Frege doesn't have sets, but you can talk about concepts and about their extensions. You can talk about concepts that are in the extension of other concepts, and so you can talk about concepts that are not in the extension of that very concept. Russell saw you could do this, and Frege saw immediately how to do it. And here we have, a problem. Frege's insisted from the beginning that inconsistent concepts are perfectly intelligible and reasonably well behaved. You know of an inconsistent concept that nothing falls under it, but that doesn't mean that you can't reason with it, that it doesn't have an inferential role, that you can show that a certain concept is inconsistent as part of a argument from reductio ad absurdum. Concepts that have nothing falling under them are just like other concepts. They're not even sort of second-class concepts, and even concepts that necessarily have nothing falling under them are still entirely tractable in you can think consistently about them. He can represent their contents and show us how to reason with them. But inconsistent objects which cannot in principle fall under any concept, those are much worse. You can't have a consistent theory of them. There can't be a model of a theory that implies the existence of inconsistent objects. The step from logical concepts to logical objects that you make by abstraction in the form of introducing courses of values was fatal to this enterprise. Now, I've described how sort of the Grundgesetze pulls together all of these different philosophical threads from Frege's life. He had no sooner published this first volume of the Grundgesetze than he gets the letter from Russell pointing out that it's inconsistent. And Frege was set back, but within a week wrote back and said, I'm sorry this is true, but thank you for showing me. Arithmetic totters, but I needed to know this. It was I love the Grundgesetze, but I love the truth more. And he really did, even though he couldn't see how could the notion of number be inconsistent? Well, this was the first episode. He was the first victim of the loss of foundations that was to characterize 20th century thought about these fundamental conceptual issues. This was a root inconsistency where we've got things that are true and are false at the same time, and that was to be joined by issues of incompleteness, Gödel's incompleteness of arithmetic. Can't have it both consistent and complete. Tarski's showing that you can't consistently have the truth predicate for your very language in that language. We've gotten somewhat jaded about this. We can handle inconsistencies and incompletenesses. I talked about the three-valued logics, K3 and LP, that Kripke and Graham Priest used to deal with these. But this was the beginning of this, and Frege sort of had to take this in a week to say, well, yes, and thank you. I'm so glad, in effect, that I didn't die before I knew this, even though he's looking at the wreckage here. In the second volume, he fixes this up. Ever since Quine addressed Frege's response in the 50s in an article called On Frege's Way Out, this has been called Frege's Way Out. Quine's essay was showing that Frege's Way Out didn't work. It didn't solve the problem. And since then, we found versions of it that do. But the first sort of systematic, reasonably successful attempt was Russell's ramified theory of types in Principia Mathematica, 1913. Frege did live to see that, saw how it could be done. But by the early 20s, Frege has actually given up on on defining numbers, understanding numbers in terms of logic, and gone back to his first love, geometry. and didn't publish anything, but we have his unpublished treatments of geometrical definitions of numbers, because apparently this logical logicist vision didn't work. Now, okay, I'm just gesturing at a vast literature on Frege's definition, the inconsistency of the Grundgesetze, and in general on the issue of the consistency of arithmetic. I'll just mention that it's a data point, an important data point in the 20th century discussion that just a couple of years after Gödel's two incompleteness results, Gensen, the founder of proof theory that treats implications as mathematical objects, proved the consistency of arithmetic, indeed of piano arithmetic, by helping himself to a somewhat more powerful form of mathematical induction, induction up to an ordinal higher than omega. But if you do that, you can prove the consistency of arithmetic. Well, Frege was the first one who was sort of confronted with all of this messiness that came to characterize 20th century philosophy. But I'm saying all of that about the consistency to put it to one side. I consider it a relatively minor blemish of the Grundgesetze that it's inconsistent. As I said, we sort of know how to deal with things like that. It's true, it explodes. You can prove everything, every statement in it, and that is a blemish. But it isn't the conceptually most important thing that happens there. That happens specifically with the introduction of courses of values. What's philosophically the most interesting and important is what happens to the notion of abstraction. Because he had raised the Julius Caesar question about expressions introduced by abstraction, cleaned up in many ways this entire philosophical tradition about abstracta and so on. Certainly, after he had done this, you couldn't think about that issue without using the apparatus that he gave us. And what was his response to the Julius Caesar problem? It was to introduce courses of values in the form of extensions, then courses of values. Well, okay, if we have to sort of unravel that, what do we say about the Julius Caesar problem and abstraction in the light of what goes on in the Grundgesetze? And the important argument there is not the arguments that got him into the inconsistency. It would come up even if, interesting form of counterfactual, even if the Grundgesetze were consistent, there would still be this issue about the Julius Caesar problem, which he took himself to have solved. He took himself to have solved it in order to take these things, truth values, which are the first two objects we get in the Grundgesetze, and identify them with courses of values. To say the true is the course of values of this function, A equals A. That was to stipulate the truth value of heterogeneous identities. And he has an argument entitling him to do that has been called brilliant, and I think it is. It's complicated. It's the argument I'm setting out, that he sets out in section 10 of the Grundgesetze, including its long, crucial footnote. And I haven't distributed that, but I did put it up on the website, just those couple of pages of section 10, and I urge you to consult that. But the question is, how does that argument work? How does he entitle himself to stipulate the truth values of heterogeneous identities, identities that have something introduced by a particular form of abstraction on one side, and on the other side, something that isn't introduced that way? Could be another abstraction. That is, if we ask whether the number 3 is identical to the direction of the Earth's axis, that's still a heterogeneous identity, even though they're both introduced by abstraction, because the equivalence relations aren't the same. It's not the same kind of abstraction. And he says, no, there is a way to entitle yourself to stipulate the truth of those identities. Remember, he had said in response to the Julius Caesar problem with the second definition of number in the Grundlagen, he had said, well, if we had the concept of a number, we could say, well, Julius Caesar doesn't fall under the concept number. He's not a number, so he's not identical to any one of these numbers I'm constructing. He said, we can't do that because I'm trying to define the concept is a number, so I can't help myself to that. But, if we could stipulate that heterogeneous identities are false, if we could say, no, Julius Caesar is not the direction of the Earth's axis, and know what we're saying, that is, have determined the sense of that identity, then indeed we would have solved the Julius Caesar problem and learned something really important about abstracta. And let me say, another reason this is absolutely urgent for Frege, which would be true even if he didn't care about numbers, and so the specific project of the Grundgesetze, the logicism project there, was not on his radar, because all of his technical concepts are introduced by abstraction. Truth values are, where we say, well, this sentence is true and this sentence is true. That's an equivalence relation. They're both true. If P is true, then P is true. If it's an equivalence relation, and we abstract to the truth values, but it's true of Bedeutungen, that whatever else is true of them, this is what generates the hierarchy on the Salva Veritate side. Two expressions have the same Bedeutung if and only if you can intersubstitute them, saving the truth value of every larger expression they occur in. That's to define them by abstraction. Senses, if you can intersubstitute them, salva consequentiae, they have the same sense. So the notion of sense is introduced by abstraction. And Frege wants to say, it's important to him to be entitled to say things about senses, for instance, that no sense is any subjective idea. The subjective ideas are owned by people, they're the ideas of someone. The senses are not like that, they're objective, even though they aren't wirklich, they aren't actual. But he wants to say things like, no sense is identical with any subjective idea. And that's a heterogeneous identity. It's got the thing introduced by abstraction, salva consequentiae, on one side, and it's got other stuff. It's also not identical to anything wirklich, he wants to say. For instance, Fido the dog is not the sense of any expression. There's a third realm. That's one of the big claims. But for it to be a third realm, its elements have to not be identical with elements of the other realms. And he insists that that's true. But how are we to understand those heterogeneous identities? So he needs a resolution of a response to the Julius Caesar problem, even if we don't care about numbers and even if we don't care about consistency of arithmetic. Maybe arithmetic tottered, maybe it doesn't make sense. We still need to know, if we're going to talk about senses and reference and truth values, if we're going to understand expressions introduced by abstraction, which includes all the semantic concepts, and indeed all philosophical concepts too, but that's beyond the argument he's making here. This is really urgent, and his contribution to that is this argument in section 10. So I want to walk through that sort of really carefully. You've got to see how that argument works. So for that, we're just going to take for granted the truth values, that they've been introduced appropriately. They are introduced by abstraction, but he's got those objects. And the way he introduces those objects, that doesn't cause an inconsistency yet. It's the general notion of courses of values that gets us that. So let's look at this on the handout. So Axiom 5 of the Grundgesetze defines the courses of values. That's with this, is it a Greek smooth breathing? Anyway, the little apostrophe that forms the names of courses of values. So the course of values of the function f, we're just going to work with monadic predicates for this purpose. You can extend it to the polyadic ones, nothing changes. The course of values of the function f is the same as, identical to, equals the course of values of the function g in case for all x, f of x, if and only if g of x. If it's true that f of x, then it's true that g of x. And he acknowledges here, without mentioning Julius Caesar, that this isn't enough to determine the Bedeutungen of the course of values expressions. But he gives a different argument than the Julius Caesar argument. It's a permutation argument. He says, suppose you took these courses of values and applied a function x to it that just permuted them, that just swapped one for another of them. Imagine them all being around, all of the values, all the courses of values being around in a circle, and you just swap each one for the one that's slightly counterclockwise of it. It's individuation preserving, so it's still the case that this equation holds a prime. So we're applying the x function, which permutes these things. It's still going to be the case that x of the course of values of f is the same as x of the course of values of g, just in case for all x, f of x, if and only if g of x. But that's not good enough to tell you whether x of the course of values of f is identical to the course of values of f or not. Now, I foreshadowed this a little bit when we were first talking about abstraction by saying, we're inclined, sort of having been as accustomed to talking this way as we are, of thinking of the direction of the Earth's axis as not just defined by an equivalence relation such that the direction of the Earth's axis is the same as the direction of line L, just in case every line that's parallel to the Earth's axis is parallel to L, but to think of the direction as the equivalence class of all the lines parallel to the Earth's axis. But for all we've said in saying that the directions are the same, if everything parallel to the one line is parallel to the other, we could just as easily use the set of lines that are perpendicular to the Earth's axis to represent the direction of the Earth's axis. It would still be the case that the direction of the Earth's axis is the same as, identical to, the direction of the axis of Venus, just in case those two lines are parallel. Well, just in case every line that's perpendicular to the Earth's axis is perpendicular to the axis of Venus, well, you have to think about it in a plane rather than three space or change your permutation. But you could represent this direction either by an equivalence class of parallel lines that are all parallel to the index line, or as an equivalence class of parallel lines that are all perpendicular to it, or any other angle between them. X is in effect taking us from the set of parallel lines to the set of perpendicular lines, which are parallel to each other. The identity and individuation of these things is the same, but the things are not the same. So it wouldn't have been settled by this. This is A double prime, whether X of the course of values of F, X of the course of values of F is identical to the course of values of G. That's a heterogeneous identity because there's the things formed by X abstraction and the things formed by the course of values abstraction. So he could have raised the problem, instead of asking whether Julius Caesar was the direction of the Earth's axis, he could have just raised this permutation issue and said, we haven't really settled the identities of things introduced by abstraction and permutations of that abstraction that appeal to the same equivalence relation but permute the items. As long as it's individuation preserving, that's what makes it a permutation. But we can do the permutation so that we know that there aren't identities of these permuted versions. So just knowing that they're identified and individuated in the same way won't tell us sort of what the things are. Is that okay so far? So now, and this is the part that I think it's Gregory Curry, the philosophical logician, who said this was a brilliant argument. Instead of taking that to be a problem, Frege uses that to solve the Julius Caesar problem. Because he says, look, what you really want to say about the question of whether Julius Caesar is identical to the direction of the Earth's axis or not is, look, I don't care about that. Say yes, say no, it doesn't matter. I only want to talk about things that have directions, lines. That's what matters. It doesn't matter at all whether you identify Julius Caesar as the direction of a line or not. Say yes or say no. The question is, well, can you make intelligible those answers? And he says, yes, we can. We can use this permutation feature of abstraction in general. This has nothing in particular to do with courses of values. This is just anything introduced by abstraction. directions are not courses of values of functions. Well, we could horse them around into that, but they aren't. To begin with, there's no expressions involved in them. He says, no, we can incorporate stipulations of the truth values of heterogeneous identities involving things that are abstracta and things that are not. The Bedeutung of the expression Fido, which is introduced by abstraction, and Fido the dog, we're going to be able to stipulate that those identities are true for all the Bedeutungen. This is the cache value for the name bearer model of Bedeutungen. He's going to show us how we can stipulate the truth of those heterogeneous identities without interfering with the abstraction that we use to define the truth values of the homogeneous identities. By constructing a permutation that is identity preserving for all the abstracta that we introduced before, but just has these additional clauses. We introduce some course of values and say, well, we're going to identify that with the true, with the course of values of this function, identify the false with the course of values of this other function. So, bottom of page 1, we've got two terms, T1 and T2, that are not introduced as courses of values. But we want to say the course of values of the function L is T1, and the course of values of the function M is T2. We want to stipulate those, where L and M can be any functions you like, because we don't care what the truth values of the heterogeneous identities are. We just need there to be a definite stipulation as to which ones of them are true and false, so that we've settled the inferential roles of all the expressions. Now, the terms that he uses in Grundgesetze and in section 10 for T1 and T2 are the true and the false. But I actually think it's clearer if we don't use those. So for his argument, suppose we've stipulated C at the top of page 2, which uses a different kind of abstraction than courses of values. We're using the tilde instead of the smooth breathing, but it's got the same criteria of identity and individuation that the courses of values does. And we're going to introduce a permutation of these tilde abstracta. So X, which has got to maintain the identity and individuation of them that's codified in principle C, but also include the stipulation of the truth values of these heterogeneous identities. So we say, in general, this is clause 5 there, for most of the cases, X of anything is just that thing. So X of a course of values is just going to be the course of values. But for these special cases, X of these special cases is not going to involve that simple identity where you can just forget about the X. In particular, X of Julius Caesar is tilde of arbitrary function L. And X of tilde of arbitrary function L, there's an embarrassing typo here where I put F instead of L in the handout. Please correct that, because we're just supposed to swap here. X of tilde of L is Julius Caesar. X of England is tilde of M. and x of tilde of m is England, and for everything else, x of that thing is just that thing. And now he's constructed this to be individuation preserving. So we can prove so we're going to be able to prove D, that is, that x of tilde of anything, and here it is f, of f, is identical to x of tilde of g, just in case for all x, fx, if and only if g of x, as we're going to be able to prove that it has the same identity and individuation as courses of values. And then, and this is how he's using this problem to solve his problem, we can define courses of values, which in this argument we haven't mentioned before. We only have the tilde abstraction, not the smooth breathing abstraction. We can define that as x of the tilde thing. That will give us, for everything that comes under clause 5, that for the courses of values, they're just identical to themselves. But for Julius Caesar, the course of values of Julius Caesar is tilde of L, the thing we picked. And the course of values of England is M. And and I want to say vice versa. That is, X of the course of values of L is Julius Caesar, and so on. So we've taken the tilde abstractor and expanded it by stipulating the truth of these four heterogeneous identities, and then stipulated those for a permutation of that tilde operator, and then identified that permutation of the tilde operator with the course of values expression. Now the tilde is introduced the same way courses of values are introduced. But what this shows is that if that definition is okay, then so is a definition that's just the same as that, except we've stipulated the truth values of these heterogeneous identities. So we can extend the definition of the abstraction, of the abstract expressions, the expressions introduced by abstraction. We can extend those to include stipulations of the truth values of heterogeneous identities, and still get something that identifies and individuates courses of values in just the same way for the homogeneous cases, which are the ones that come under the extremal clause 5. Now, in the context of the Grundgesetze, this is absolutely licit. Given the definition, here I'm 2/3 of the way down on page 2, given the definition E, that's the definition of the extended definition of courses of values as X of the tilde of things, and the truth of principle D, that is the being individuation preserving of X, then principle A for courses of values follows immediately from the fact that we introduced the tilde using that. And clauses 2 and 4 of the definition, together with E, entail the principle B, that is the truth of those heterogeneous identities, with the substitution of Julius Caesar for T1 and England for T2. So given only the homogeneous identities in C, we've constructed courses of values in such a way that their homogeneous identities in A can be shown to hold, and in such a way that heterogeneous identities can be proven for two of them, for the L and the M courses of values that we just arbitrarily picked for this purpose. I mean, for his purpose, he's not going to pick them arbitrarily. He wants something true to be, something that has the truth value true to be the representative of the true, and something that's false to be the representative of the false. But the general procedure, you just pick some arbitrary one. He's showing that arbitrary stipulations of the heterogeneous identities are intelligible. He can say, he can consistently stipulate those. So we could just, stipulate the falsities of the ones we want, or arbitrary truths, as I say, things we've introduced by abstraction, the Bedeutung of expression Fido, which is the same as the Bedeutung of some other expression, my favorite dog, let's say, just in case substituting the one for the other never changes the truth value of any complex sentence they're involved in. You can say that, and you can stipulate. And the Bedeutung of Fido, the expression, is the dog Fido. In this way, he's showing that you can coherently do that in this way. So this is the brilliant argument that I think has been overshadowed by the fact that the definition of the contingent, in some sense, fact that the definition of courses of values he's introduced here is inconsistent with full generality. But the question is a question about abstraction in general, not just abstraction of courses of values, where it turns out we've overstepped our expressive bounds and have a definition that's too expressively powerful. That's what leads to the inconsistency. But the general question is a question about abstracta and concreta, or anyway, abstractions, things introduced by abstraction and things not introduced by abstraction. And his solution goes through even if the abstraction is common or garden variety abstraction, not something that ends up quantifying over all functions, including functions that are constructed using true and so on. Directions of lines. We can stipulate that England is the direction of the Earth's axis consistently, and know how to reason with that by this argument. So I think this argument should have gotten a lot more attention than it has. It got overshadowed by the fact that the particular form he cares about happens to lead to a contradiction. But directions of lines don't lead to a contradiction, but there's still a Julius Caesar problem for them, and this is his solution. Okay. The claim I want to make is, although this works fine in the context of Grundgesetze, it doesn't solve the problem for abstraction, for directions of lines. It doesn't. There's a conceptual flaw in it. It works in the context of Grundgesetze, but if we look at it as a solution to the general issue about abstraction, it doesn't. And the reason is subtle and interesting. But why don't we take our break, and I'll try and make that out when we get back. It's 2:34. Let's come back at 2:49. Okay, so as if that argument weren't enough to wrap our minds around, now I want to think about how that could be used to do something that he doesn't need to do in Grundgesetze, namely be a general account of how we should think about the relation between terms introduced by abstraction and terms that are not introduced by abstraction, how we should think about the relation between the homogeneous identities that are settled by the abstractive definition and the heterogeneous ones that aren't. What he's shown here is that you can piecemeal extend the specification of the use of the terms introduced by abstraction in a way that incorporates stipulating the truth values of some heterogeneous identities. But what he's shown, and the reason it works in the context of Grundgesetze, is if you do that for some specific heterogeneous terms, the trouble with the argument is this extremal clause 5 that says, and for everything else y, and that is everything that doesn't fall under one of the other conditions, x of y is just the same as y. That's going to ensure, since the tilde operation was introduced with the same definition that axiom 5 gave for courses of values, that for all the ones that aren't involved in these heterogeneous identities, you just get the courses of values back. And that's okay here because the only things that have been introduced in Grundgesetze are the two truth values and the courses of values. So when you say everything else, that means, well, not the true because that's involved in, one of these, not the false because that's involved in it, not for L or for M because those are the ones we connected with this, but any of the other objects that I've defined, X is to be a constant function. But for the general case, if we ask, well, what about the direction of the Earth's axis? Is that a course of values in this new expanded definition of a course of values? Well, to answer that, we've got to know, well, is it identical to Julius Caesar? Is it identical to the course of values of the function L? Is it identical to England? Is it identical to the course of values of the function M? If none of those identities are true, then X of the direction of the Earth's axis is the direction of the Earth's axis. But how do we know whether the direction of the Earth's axis is identical to Julius Caesar or to the course of values of function L? We just don't. Nothing that's been stipulated tells us the truth of those heterogeneous identities. We stipulated the truth of heterogeneous identities involving Julius Caesar and England on the one hand, and tilde expressions on the other hand. Those we stipulated. But that doesn't help us with anything that wasn't subject to one of those particular stipulations. We don't need to worry about those in the context of the constructive project building up from the base in Grundgesetze, because we've only got the truth values and the courses of values. That's all the objects. When we quantify, we say everything. That's what Y ranges over, is those things. And he's showing us that for any heterogeneous identity, you could add it into the Grundgesetze system by having a pair of stipulations of the sort that we get in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 of that 5-membered definition. We could do that one by one. So we could extend and say now, well, we have now our new notion of courses of values that doesn't just identify the truth values with courses of values, but also includes stipulating that the direction of the Earth's axis is the course of values of this function, say, that assigns to each line its direction, or some arbitrary Grundgesetze function. We could stipulate that. That much works. But if we want to know how to use this to understand heterogeneous identities generally, it's actually of no use in doing that, because this extremal clause presupposes, in order to know which clause the direction of the Earth's axis falls under, we have to know, does it fall under condition 1? Well, it does if it's the tilde of L, but how do we know that? It comes under clause 2 if it's Julius Caesar, but we don't know whether the direction of the Earth's axis is Julius Caesar. Here, we assumed that we knew that England was not Julius Caesar, because the course of values of L needn't be the course of values of M. But in the case of the true and the false, we know that the true isn't the false isn't the true. But we don't know whether the direction of the Earth's axis is the true, or Julius Caesar, or tilde of any of these things. So, this is an instance of a subtle issue. When you give an argument by cases, it's got to be that the cases are mutually exclusive, so nothing falls under more than one of them. Otherwise, you'd be assigning it two different values of the function. So it has to fall under no more than one of these clauses. And it's got to be exhaustive. Everything's got to fall under one of them if it results in a total function. And you can do that by enumeration, which is in effect what he does in the Grundgesetz. It makes that extremal clause universal by enumerating what the objects are. There's the true, the false, and there's the terms we introduced by course of values abstraction. But that extremal clause, to make your definition by cases define a complete function, you have to make sure that it's that everything falls under one of the clauses. And you can have an extremal clause, and if none of the other conditions holds, this holds, as long as you're entitled to quantify over those things. And for that, you've got to be able to tell of each of the things whether it falls under one of the other conditions or not. And we can only do that for things that were already on the table in the Grundgesetze here. So, he's showing something important. As he says in the footnote, he considers could we then just identify every object with the course of values of a function that has only that assigns only that object to the true? So any concept that applies only to that one thing. In Quine, at one point, eliminates individual constants from his sort of regimented English in favor of particularized predicates. So we don't have the name Pegasus, we have the property Pegasizes, which is true only of Pegasus. And we just use those functions. Frege says, well, could we do that? And in effect says, no, we couldn't. For essentially the reason that I'm using here, he says, we'll do something like that in the Grundgesetze later on. But again, he can do that because you can enumerate everything, all the terms in the language there. But if we're worried about abstraction in general and the meaning of these heterogeneous identities. For instance, the Bedeutung of Fido is Fido. Then we need some general procedure. The fact that for any particular ones we could make a stipulation isn't generally telling us what we need to know about the truth values of these heterogeneous identities. Being able to stipulate them, given a set of objects not introduced by that very abstraction operator, given a set of those, he's shown a general procedure for extending the abstraction operator to get a cousin of it that includes whatever stipulations you like about the truth values of these heterogeneous identities. But that isn't a general enough solution to the problem that he raises in the Grundlagen about the second definition. See how this goes? As I say, it's a subtle thing about definitions or arguments by cases, and it's a particular danger where you have an extremal clause, where you say, well, if this condition holds, do this. If this condition holds, do that. Okay, the conditions need to be exclusive, but if the only way you can make it exhaustive is to say, and in any other case, do this, then you've also got to have a way of telling for any other case whether it's identical to one of the cases you already had. And that depends on what you're defining, whether you can do that or not. For the Julius Caesar case, no, we can always introduce more terms and ask whether they're identical to these things. And definitions by abstraction are not going to settle the truth of those identities. As I say, good enough for Grundgesetze, and it's not extending. He acknowledges in this footnote that each time you do this, you're changing the concept of a course of values. If you define the course of values by E here, that's a different definition than the definition in A, because it incorporates the stipulations about these heterogeneous identities, but it's a conservative extension. That's what Clause 5 gives you. It's a conservative extension of the other, and he's showing you can always do that. And they're going to have to do it. He's going to have to do it a couple more times in the Grundgesetze. That you can do. It is a change of concept. Each time you do that, you need to keep track of that. But it's like the change of concept of number when we allow negative numbers as well as positive numbers or extend it to rational numbers. Yes, you've changed the notion of number, but in a conservative way, the things that are true of natural numbers are still true of them. And but you have to beware of these extremal clauses. And if what we care about is, for instance, what you're saying, what's the sense, and so the inferential role of the claim, no subjective idea is identical to the sense of any expression. If you want to say that, as he does, you haven't given a sense to that by this procedure. So I think it is a brilliant solution to his problem in Grundgesetze, which is he needs to settle the truth of all the identities that have any Grundgesetze term on the left side and any Grundgesetze term on the right side. He needs to settle those. And there's a bunch of don't cares that are the heterogeneous identities. And as long as he can enumerate all the terms of the language, that's perfectly okay. Those extensions do the job he wants them to do. And they're not responsible for the excess of expressive power that leads to the inconsistency. That's particular to courses of values of functions, given that the notion of function is so general. So a bunch of peculiar counterfactuals, even if the Grundgesetze were consistent, we would still see a solution that was now very restricted as far as the issue about abstraction that he raised in connection with the second definition of number in Grundlagen, but that's still with us. How are we to think about heterogeneous identities that have something introduced by an abstraction, by a process of abstraction on one side, and things that were not introduced by that, by the same abstractor, the same equivalence relation. They could be abstract themselves, or they could be, wirklich and causally efficacious, like Fido the dog. We still want to know how to think about them. Now, next time, our last class, when, of course, I'll be trying to do a summing up also, I want to look closer at this requirement that the functions be total, that in order to count as having settled the sense of any one identity, you have to have settled the sense of all of them. That if there's some C such that it's not settled, whether it's identical to A or B, then you haven't settled the sense of the identity A equals B. That's a principle that's driving a lot of this. He needs that for Grundgesetze to do what he wants to do with it. But he's got these much more general semantic terms. And in particular, if we're thinking of what he does here as the next evolution of the transformation of the perennial philosophical problem of the many and the one, the problem of universals, the problem of forms. If we think of this as the step after his transformation of that problem by getting clear about the notion of abstraction, so that ever after, when we think about universals, we should be thinking about what we're doing when we abstract. If we think of this as the next evolution of that, he hasn't really solved the problem that he raised in the Grundlagen, which is not to say that the Grundgesetze fails. This move is okay in the context of the Grundgesetze, but it doesn't generalize outside of this particular construction. It doesn't generalize to respond to the Julius Caesar question. So we're still left with that. And I think there are things to say about it, even in Fregean terms, but I'll try and do that next time. So, here's Frege's masterwork, the Grundgesetze, and he doesn't even get to publish the whole thing before it's refuted, in a letter by the only philosopher who ever really took him seriously. Well, I shouldn't say that. Carnap took him seriously, and Carnap's Doktorvater, Bruno Bauch, was Frege's colleague in Jena. That's where Carnap wrote his dissertation, and of course Wittgenstein came and studied as well. But of the grown-ups, ones not people who were sort of students of his, it really was only Russell. And basically their first interaction was for Russell to devastate this project. So that's 1893. Frege was 45 years old. He had published the Begriffsschrift at 31 and done this incredible work over the next 15 years to bring it to this point, to pull together the threads that I was talking about, what he'd already done in Begriffsschrift, the definition of number in the Grundlagen, the introduction of the notion of abstraction in the Grundlagen, the introduction of extensions in to resolve difficulties with abstraction in function and concept, and making the distinction between Sinn and Bedeutung that let him really understand his notation for the first time. As I say, the expressions of Grundgesetze designate Bedeutungen. They are modes of presentation of Bedeutungen. That's sort of the content of what they say, and they show their sense. They show how the Bedeutung is determined. That's the sense in which this is a perspicuous notation. He did all of that, pulled all of those threads together, and then, sorry, Frege, it doesn't work, and it sort of can't be made to work, or at least you will die before you see how it can be made to work. So, piled on the fact that he got only subsistence support from academia, no recognition, never became an ordinarius professor, no respect really from his colleagues in the math department, but okay, he was pulling this project together and brought it off, and it was immediately refuted, and he just pulled his socks up and continued to work on it, but not a happy man. And then he retired, sold the house that he had bought when he first moved to Jena on Professor's Hill, which it still is there, that there's this dozen of houses, big, beautiful houses that they said, okay, our professors are going to live in these, and they were all the famous professors did, and he had the money from the gymnasium, the private school that his father had run, and so he bought this house for him and his mother to live in, and then his rest of his family, but never made enough money to keep it up, had to rent everything above the first floor to keep it together, and of course did not become a professor. But he did get a substantial chunk of money, when he retired 25 years afterwards. And that was 1925. And between the time he got that money and could have used it to buy a place up north where he wanted to retire, we had the hyperinflation, and it was all just gone. So his disappointments were not done with the Russell letter. He also was completely impoverished within a year of retiring. So his unpleasant politics are intelligible in these terms. We have a letter from him in 23 saying, "Yeah, this young guy Adolf Hitler, he's got the right idea. He's got some good ideas that fit in with sort of environmental." I don't think he was more anti-Semitic than the people he talked to in Jena were, but it's certainly horrifyingly so from our point of view. He definitely believed in the backstabbing theory of World War I after this time. Interestingly, being Frege, he devoted himself to the formal solution of this political problem and said, look, this liberal democracy is a terrible idea. You've got the rabble voting, and of course they're going to debase the currency, so they can borrow money and pay it back more cheaply. Anytime you let the rabble vote, that's what's going to happen. But we seem to be stuck with this voting thing. What would be a better way of doing it? And so he was one of the first to think mathematically about voting systems. A voting system as it's become a function from a bunch of individual preference orderings to a joint preference ordering. That's the most abstract way to think about voting. One of the undercutting, uneasy formal results of the 20th century is Arrow's theorem that says there is no voting function, no way of aggregating these individual preference orderings that doesn't violate some minimal constraint on voting systems. That is, in particular, that there is no way of combining these individual preferences into a joint one such that it would never be rational for you to misrepresent your preferences, vote for people you didn't prefer, because that made it more likely that you would get the preference you wanted. Strategic voting. So there is no such function. Mathematically, there is no such function. But Frege spent the last years of his life designing voting systems and promoting them. Oh boy, you think his colleagues wouldn't listen to him. He got kicked out of every political office when he went to pitch these things. But his idea was, and this is something Dummett looked into, his idea was that voting was okay. The bad thing about it was if your guy lost, your vote was wasted. And so what he proposed was everyone who voted for someone who wasn't elected got to keep that vote and use it again the next year. And if it was lost the next year, well, then you had 3 votes in the next election, and so on. And to make this wieldy, you could assign those to a party. You could say, well, in this new election, I have a vote left over from last year. Whatever the Democrats decide, well, he wouldn't have been for him, but anyway, whatever this party decides, whoever they nominate, they get my vote for this. He says, look, this would solve the problem of an oppressed minority that is never going to have, a majority of votes, but if they accumulate them, eventually could elect their person rather than somebody that everybody right now wanted. What we have to do is make these votes not immortal, they're still mortal. Eventually, you'll elect your person and then you start over. But in the meantime, the fact that you lost makes you more powerful politically. So you can maybe imagine he's going to the politicians and saying, why don't you make the elections work like this? And they just did not want to think about this. I'm sorry, we're not going to expend our political capital in order to change the voting system in this way. But you can think about anyway. This was his constructive response, was to endorse this other voting scheme. That's good and sufficient for today. We don't have a meeting next week because of the holiday. So I'll see you in 2 weeks to try and pull this stuff together.